I retired in 2022, and because all my life I was a commercial salmon fisher, I always got off work in late fall, and it was never a good time to visit the rest of Canada because of the weather. So after I retired, I really wanted to have a look and see what Canada was all about. And my first excursions were into northern BC and into the Yukon. And I was fascinated with that country. And in 2023, I drove the Dempster Highway in the fall up to Tuktoyaktuk. And that was one amazing trip, especially with the fall colors. So I became fascinated with the North, and I started reading the history books, the early discoveries, the early explorers, especially the Sir John Franklin expedition that was lost in 1845. And I decided to go and see these areas that I had read so much about. And so in 2024, my game plan was to have a look at Nunavut, starting off at Gjoa Haven, which is the closest community to where the wrecks of the Erebus and the Terror were found, on King William Island. So I drove up to Yellowknife, and from there I flew to Gjoa Haven, where I spent 5 days. And that was such a contrast to anything I had ever seen in Canada. Those are the barren grounds, and they're called that for a reason. It basically, when I landed in Gjoa Haven, it looked like a gravel beach with moss and lichens growing on it. So, and it's hard to imagine that animals and people could exist in an environment like that. But they had. And in fact, in 1903, Roald Amundsen spent 2 years in Gjoa Haven doing scientific research on the magnetic pole. His boat was called the Gjoa, and they found this perfect little harbor to spend the winter in, and they named the place Gjoa Haven. Now, in those days, in 1903, the Inuit were nomadic and traveled in small family groups, so there were no communities at all. But eventually, more and more Inuit discovered that Amundsen was staying in Gjoa Haven, and they migrated to that area so that they could trade and get some of the luxury European goods like steel and things like that. And that's how that community got started. And when you go to Gjoa Haven, you'll see all these remembrances of Amundsen, because he was the first one to ever sail through the Northwest Passage. But when I arrived in Gjoa Haven, I arrived there on September the 5th, and the reason I picked that time of year is that when I Googled Gjoa Haven, they said that they had a shipwreck festival starting at September 1st through September the 10th. So I really wanted to be there in quotes for that festival. But when I arrived, I found out, well, the word festival may have been an exaggeration, because what happens is that cruise ships stop at Gjoa Haven, and there's no docks for the cruise ships to land, so they ferry all the passengers off by Zodiac boats, and they take them to the beach. And then they divide the passengers up into groups of about 20 people, and each group has a leader, and they walk around Gjoa Haven to all the historical sites. For instance, the Hudson Bay Company cabin that was established in 1920. And they talk about the history of the place and Amundsen. And they will go to the Elders Center, where there's a demonstration put on for drum dancing. And then at the end of this tour, they end up at the large community hall where there's square dancing displays, there's throat singing displays, and they put on in quotes, a big feast of local foods for the passengers. So these passenger liners are not big. The biggest one would carry maybe about 300 people and less. So this particular year, in 2024, there had been 8 cruise ships that had stopped into Gjoa Haven. And they only spend about 4 or 5 hours there once the tour of the village or the hamlet is completed. The ships take off and complete the Northwest Passage. So it wasn't really a festival. It's more like an event when a cruise ship comes in. So anyway, during that time, I saw 2 cruise ships come in, and I just joined along on the tour, and found an English-speaking tour and followed along. But I had way more fun just wandering around Gjoa Haven by myself. And of course, one of the first things I was concerned about walking away from the hamlet was, is there any chance of me running into polar bears? So as I was walking through the hamlet, I found a wildlife office, and I went in, and I spoke to the wildlife officer, Brendan. And he was extremely friendly, like most people in Nunavut are. And we talked for a substantial amount of time. And then he offered to take me out into his ATV, out into what they call the land. Now, Gjoa Haven is on King William Island, and once you go inland, they call that the land. And so I took him up on his offer, and that was fun. But you have to dress warmly. The temperature was +6, but in that country, because there's no vegetation, there's lots of wind. So I had thermal underwear, tops and bottom. I had a heavy coat, and then I had Gore-Tex Mountain Equipment Co-op jacket and pants. And those were really important because they're windproof. And wearing that combination with a toque, I was actually really quite comfortable. But riding on the back of that ATV is quite an experience. It's like being on a bucking horse. And I thought I would try to take a video of what it was like, but nope, because I was hanging on with both hands. There's the road. If there is a road, it's really quite rough, but a lot of times they just go off road. And we were looking at the streams that Arctic char go up, but I was too late for that. I missed the Arctic char run by about 2 weeks. One thing that was really interesting about Nunavut is that I couldn't believe the number of people that smoked. And Brendan was no different. He smoked cigarettes. And so as a way of saying thank you, I thought I'd just go to the local store co-op and buy him a carton of cigarettes, because he spent 3 or 4 hours with me. And it was very, very pleasant. And I couldn't believe the cost of a package of cigarettes. It was $33.50 a pack. So I spent $330 on a carton of cigarettes. Yeah, I am glad I had quit smoking 25 years ago. Think of all the money I saved. King William Island was named in 1830 by the explorer James Clark Ross. And it was named after King William IV, who at that time was the king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. So, yeah, many of these places in Nunavut have still retained their early English names, but gradually over time, all the English names are being replaced by the Inuit names. Takes a while to learn how to pronounce some of them. I had quite a bit of difficulty with it, but getting a bit used to it. See you next time.